Look at that scope! What a joke! He won't hit anything with that rusty relic.
March 1943. Outskirts of Caen, Normandy. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and cordite. Frost clung to the ruined hedgerows where once green fields had been turned into mud and memory. A pale morning fog rolled low over the valley, wrapping the broken world in silence. Only the distant rumble of artillery hinted that war was still breathing somewhere beyond the mist. Among the scattered wrecks and frozen ditches lay Corporal William Carter, 27, a British sniper with the 5th Infantry Brigade. His uniform was torn, knees muddy, face streaked with soot. The cold had turned his lips pale, but his eyes, steady, pale gray, missed nothing. Cradled against his shoulder was an old Lee-Enfield No. 4 rifle, modified by his own hands. The barrel was worn, the wooden stock cracked, and the scope, a patchwork of scratched lenses and bent screws, looked more like a relic than a weapon. To his comrades, it was a joke. They called it the rust bucket, sometimes Carter's miracle stick. When he cleaned it by the dim firelight, men would chuckle, whispering, "That thing couldn't hit a barn," let alone a Jerry. Even his Sergeant Harris smirked once and said, "Carter, one day that antique's going to explode in your hands." But Carter never answered back. He just smiled, calm, tired, like a man who'd already seen what fear could do. He had fought since Dunkirk. He had seen men panic, men pray, men vanish under shells. The rifle wasn't perfect, but neither was he, and somehow both had survived everything the Germans threw their way. He had built the scope himself months earlier, scavenging from the wreck of a German truck. Inside he'd found a shattered Zeiss optic, cracked, but still clear through one lens. He filed the glass by hand, sealed it with wax, and bolted it onto his Enfield with 2 rusted screws in prayer. The others called it madness. To Carter, it was precision reborn from ruin. He believed that rifles didn't make the shot. Men did. The weapon was only a reflection of its shooter's patience. And Carter had patience enough to wait out a storm if he had. So on March 19th, before sunrise, word came down from command. German armor had been sighted near a captured village 3 hills east. A panzer officer was reportedly directing tank movements, the kind of man whose death could stall an entire advance. They needed a sniper who could reach him before he escaped. Everyone looked at Carter, even Sergeant. Harris went quiet for a moment before saying, "Take your museum piece, lad. Let's see if that rust can do more than shine." Carter checked his rifle, turning the stiff bolt with care. The metal creaked but locked true. He tightened the strap on his helmet, exhaled slowly, and whispered to himself, "Half a mile's just a number." The others watched as he crawled into the fog, a lone figure fading into gray light, the barrel of his old rifle catching a dull glint from the morning sun. Somewhere ahead through the mist waited the enemy, and the chance to prove that sometimes the most broken tools could make the sharpest marks. The air was still. The hunt had begun. The world shrank to the width of his rifle barrel. Carter crawled through wet grass, inch by inch, the cold seeping through his uniform until even his bones ached. The mist was thick enough to hide an army, but that was exactly why he preferred it. Fog didn't ask questions. It didn't judge old rifles or broken scopes. It simply covered the living and the dead alike. By mid-morning, he'd reached the edge of a ridge overlooking the valley. Down below, through folds of smoke and early light, he could just make out St. Maurice, the ruined French village the Germans had turned into a fortress. Blackened rooftops, shattered steeples, and the crawling shapes of soldiers moving among sandbags and armored vehicles. Somewhere among them was the man he'd been sent to find, the Panzer Command officer. Carter unpacked his scope cloth and wiped away condensation. The lens, though scratched, caught enough light to give him an image. It wasn't clear, not like the new Zeiss optics the others carried, but he'd learned to see through imperfection, to read shadows instead of lines. A voice crackled faintly through his radio. "Carter, this is Harris. Report position, over." He pressed the button softly. "Ridge north of St. Maurice." No movement yet. "Holding position. Copy that. Keep your head low, lad." "Intel says they've got spotters in the bell tower." Carter smiled faintly. Wouldn't be the first time someone's tried to spot me. He slid the rifle forward, nestling it into the damp soil. Every muscle moved slow, deliberate. He watched the village for signs of command, the way men gathered where orders came from. Snipers weren't just shooters. They were readers of chaos. Then he saw it. Near the church square, beside a Panzerwehr, a tall figure in a gray trench coat, officer's cap glinting with silver insignia. The way soldiers snapped to attention around him told Carter everything. That was the man. He checked the distance through his map and range markers. 800 meters. Maybe more. Too far for most rifles, especially with a wind like this. But Carter wasn't most. He adjusted his homemade scope. One tiny screw, one heartbeat. The reticle swam slightly, blurred at the edges, but he'd long stopped chasing perfection. He exhaled, slow and steady. In that moment, the world felt weightless. No war, no laughter, no doubts. Just him and the target. Then came the distraction, a sudden crack of machine gun fire from the left flank, German patrols sweeping the ridge below. Bullets tore through branches just yards away. Carter froze. The patrol was too close. If they climbed any higher, they'd spot his position and call in artillery, he whispered under his breath. Not now. Not yet. Carter flattened himself against the earth, barely breathing. The German voices drew nearer, boots crunching over gravel and leaves. He could see their helmets now. 3, maybe 4 of them. One wrong breath, and it would all end here. He waited until the wind shifted, carrying the fog thicker across the ridge. Then, with precise timing, he slid sideways, inching toward a patch of fallen logs. The rifle never left his hands. When one of the Germans paused, listening, Carter could almost hear his heartbeat echoing in his ears. Seconds felt like minutes. Finally, the patrol moved on. Ghosts fading into fog. Carter let out a quiet breath, his body shaking from the tension he refused to show. He looked back down toward the village. The German officer was still there, gesturing to the tank crew. Carter whispered, "You waited for me." "Good." He settled back behind the scope, every nerve returning to focus. His finger rested lightly on the trigger. His breath slowed, and through the cracked lens, the officer came into perfect view. Half a mile of distance, one shot between failure and history. The air was still again. Carter was ready. The ridge was silent now, the kind of silence that made even the grass seem afraid to move. Carter wiped the dirt from his cheek, took one final breath, and let his heart beat slow until it matched the rhythm of the wind. He'd been trained to shoot between heartbeats, to let instinct take over when precision mattered more than pulse. Through his rusty homemade scope, the officer's shape danced slightly in the haze, bending and twisting with the heat rising from the Panzer's engine. The man stood tall, confident, unaware that a British sniper was watching from nearly 1,200 yards away. He barked orders, pointed toward the hills, and laughed with a nearby crewman, a man certain he was safe behind steel and distance. Carter adjusted the windage dial on his rifle, though the markings had long worn off. He did it by feel, by memory. The grass told him the wind's direction. The smoke from the burning village told him its strength. He shifted his aim 2 inches left, then 1 hair up. He whispered, almost inaudibly, "Come on, old girl. Just once more." He squeezed the trigger halfway. A deep breath, then a gentle pull. The shot cracked through the fog like thunder. For a split second, nothing moved. The recoil pressed into his shoulder, and his eye caught the shimmer of the bullet's vapor trail slicing through the mist. Then, impact. The officer jerked, staggered, then dropped to his knees beside the tank. The crew around him froze, confusion spreading like wildfire. Carter exhaled softly, whispering, "Target down," but celebration was a luxury he couldn't afford. The sound of his rifle had given away his position. Within seconds, German soldiers shouted, pointing toward the ridge. A machine gun opened up, spraying lead into the hillside. Dirt and splinters exploded around him. Carter rolled sideways, dragging his rifle through the mud. He knew this dance. Fire, relocate, vanish. He slid behind a broken stone wall and reloaded, the cold brass cartridge clicking into place. Another burst of gunfire whistled overhead, cutting through the fog like angry bees. "Bravo team, Carter!" Harris's voice crackled through the radio. "Report, did you confirm the kill?" Carter ducked, pressing the radio close. "Confirmed. Officer neutralized. They're blind on armor movement. Bloody hell, lad, get out of there." "They're sweeping the ridge." He smiled faintly. "Wouldn't be the first time." He began crawling downhill, each movement silent, deliberate. His fingers were numb from cold and adrenaline. Behind him, the Germans were firing blindly into the mist, unaware he was already gone. The fog had become his ally again, swallowing him whole. As he moved deeper into the forest, he caught a glimpse of the village through a gap in the trees. The panzer crews were scrambling now, confused, leaderless. The British artillery took the chance. Shells whistled overhead and slammed into the square. Smoke and chaos erupted where order had stood minutes before. Carter watched from cover, breathing heavy, chest tight. He had seen this before, the brief satisfaction of a perfect shot, drowned by the echo of more explosions. There were no cheers for snipers, no medals for a single bullet. Just another day survived. He checked his rifle again. Mud on the barrel, rust creeping further across the bolt, scope glass chipped worse than before. But it had done its job. One impossible shot, half a mile through fog and fear. Carter whispered, "Guess they'll stop laughing now." But deep down, he knew tomorrow they'd laugh again. Soldiers needed something to laugh at in a war that rarely offered reasons to smile. He slung the rifle across his shoulder and began the long walk back toward the lines, one slow step at a time. Behind him, the fog rolled back over the valley, covering the dead and the living alike. The war moved on. But somewhere in the ruins of St. Maurice, a single bullet had just rewritten how legends were born. By the time Corporal William Carter reached the British lines, dusk had settled over the ridge. The fog had lifted, leaving behind the gray ghosts of a battlefield still smoking from artillery strikes. His uniform was soaked, his hands numb, and the once brown stock of his Lee-Enfield rifle was now black with mud. He moved like a man who'd seen too much, each step heavy with exhaustion and memory. At the forward trench, soldiers lifted their heads as he passed. Some looked surprised. One whispered, "Bloody hell, he's still alive." Another muttered, "That's the bloke with the rusty scope, isn't it?" Carter didn't respond. He just nodded slightly, eyes focused on nothing in particular. The adrenaline was fading, and the weight of what he'd done, of what it cost, began to settle. He reached the dugout where Sergeant Harris waited, arms crossed, radio buzzing faintly behind him. Harris looked up, disbelief mixing with pride. "Report, Carter." Carter leaned his rifle against the wall, took off his helmet, and said quietly, "Target eliminated." "One shot, confirmed officer rank." The armor column scattered. Harris blinked, almost smiling. "One shot? Through that fog?" "Half a mile, give or take." Christ almighty. The sergeant stepped closer, eyeing the rifle like it was some mythical relic. "And with that thing?" Carter shrugged. "Rust doesn't stop a bullet, sir." A few men chuckled under their breath. The laughter this time was different. Not mockery, but disbelief. Word spread fast through the camp. Before long, someone from artillery came by just to see the sniper who nailed a German officer from 1,200 yards with a homemade scope. They asked questions, wanted to touch the rifle. Carter allowed it, but his expression never changed. He didn't care for fame. He just wanted quiet. That night, around the campfire, the teasing turned into stories. Private Collins, who once called his rifle a museum piece, now told others, "I saw it myself, lads." One shot dropped him like a stone. Through fog, no less. Each retelling grew a little taller. Soon, Carter had supposedly taken the shot blindfolded in the rain at a moving tank. Soldiers needed myths to survive. And for the first time, Carter became one. But legends don't sleep easy. As the others celebrated with tea and laughter, Carter sat apart, cleaning his rifle. The scope was cracked worse than before, one lens chipped clean through. He ran a cloth over it gently, as if apologizing. In the flickering light, he thought of the German officer, a man with a name, probably a family, maybe a photograph in his coat. War made you forget that sometimes. Sergeant Harris approached quietly. "You did good today, lad." Saved a lot of lives, Carter looked up. Did I? Harris frowned. You stopped their armor. That counts for something. Carter nodded slowly, but said nothing more. Deep down, he knew that tomorrow the enemy would send another officer, another tank, another reason to pull the trigger. The sergeant clapped him on the shoulder and left him alone. Carter stared at the fire until it burned to embers. Somewhere in the distance, artillery flashed again, lighting up the horizon like lightning, he whispered softly. To no one in particular, half a mile away. But it still feels too close. The night swallowed his words. Around him, soldiers snored, laughed, dreamed of home. But Carter sat awake, polishing the same old rifle everyone had once mocked. The same weapon that had just turned ridicule into respect. And as dawn crept back over Normandy, one thought echoed in his mind. The war wasn't over. Not for him. Not yet. The war rolled on, indifferent to legends. Weeks passed since the shot at St. Maurice, but for Corporal William Carter, time had begun to lose shape. The British line kept moving east, pushing deeper into occupied France, every mile bought with another name written on a casualty tag. Carter moved with them, always silent, always watching. His rifle, the same battered Lee-Enfield No. 4, had become a camp legend now. Men would nod when he passed, whispering stories they'd heard secondhand. Some saluted him, others asked for shooting tips. But Carter never leaned into the praise. He only said, "It's the rifle that does the work," though he knew it wasn't true. One morning, a supply officer offered him a brand-new Enfield with a factory Zeiss scope. Clean, gleaming, precise. Carter looked at it, then down at his old rifle. The wood was worn smooth where his hands had held it for years. The metal was pitted and scarred. He smiled faintly. "Appreciate it," he said, "but I'll stick with what's already proven itself." The officer raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. Men like Carter had earned the right to their quirks. Days later, his unit found itself dug in along the edge of a forest overlooking another small French village. The air was thick with tension. German armor had been sighted again, advancing along the road below. Command wanted overwatch, and naturally, all eyes turned to Carter. He took position beneath a broken oak, setting his scope toward the open fields. The glass was cracked worse than ever, but he'd learned to see through imperfection. He lined up the sight, adjusting by instinct. The world around him faded into rhythm. The ticking of wind, the distant rumble of tanks, the soft crunch of boots behind him. Private Collins crawled up beside him, whispering, "Heard the story again last night, about your 1,200-yard shot." "Some blokes say it was more like 2,000, Carter chuckled under his breath. "Stories grow faster than weeds," Collins smiled. "Still, makes us believe we got men like you on our side." Carter didn't reply. He just peered through the lens again. In the distance, figures were moving. German troops, helmets catching the sun. He steadied his breathing. Through that fogged glass, he wasn't seeing enemies anymore. He was seeing silhouettes, tired, cold men same as him. Some barely old enough to shave, following orders they never wrote. He hesitated, finger resting on the trigger, for a long moment. He thought of home. His father's old hunting rifle, the sound of rain on London rooftops, the way his mother said his name like it meant something more than a rank. A shell exploded somewhere down the valley, snapping him back. The war was still here, still hungry. Carter exhaled and shifted his aim. The old rifle groaned as he squeezed off a shot, a single, sharp echo across the fields. The bullet found its mark. Another life ended. Another few saved. He lowered the rifle slowly, eyes distant. Collins looked at him, waiting for a word, but Carter said nothing. There was no pride in this, no victory. Just distance, half a mile of silence between one man breathing and another not. When the battle ended, Carter cleaned his rifle again, same as always. Each stroke of the cloth was quiet penance. He wasn't sure why he still did it. Maybe because it was all that kept his hands from shaking. That night, as the firelight flickered against his face, Sergeant Harris sat beside him and said softly, "You know, they'll talk about that shot for years." Carter stared into the flames. "Let them talk. I'll just remember the wind." The next morning, the unit moved on. Carter slung the rifle across his back, the same rusty scope, the same creaking strap. And though the war still roared around him, he walked steady, calm, eyes forward, Somewhere behind him, men still laughed at old jokes, unaware that the legend they'd built was just a man. Tired, quiet, and half a mile removed from everything he'd lost.